So, if you rewind to June 2026, there was this 14-point piece of paper signed that, honestly, it effectively put a 60-day ticking clock on the entire global economy.
Yeah, it really did. I mean, we're talking about an interim agreement between the U.S. and Iran that was designed to just, freeze decades of hostility.
Right. But if you look closely at the actual text, the mechanics of this deal are so complex. I mean, the deadlines are just punishingly tight.
Oh, absolutely.
It feels like this crazy diplomatic high-wire act being performed in, like, a hurricane.
That's a great way to put it because, the stakes here really cannot be overstated.
Mhm.
We are looking at a fundamental rewiring of Middle Eastern security and global energy flows.
Yeah.
You have this promise of a massive military stand down, but, and this is the catch, it is entirely contingent on unfreezing billions of dollars and executing, well, basically physical and logistical miracles in one of the world's most congested waterways.
Right, and that is exactly what we're dissecting today on the deep dive. We're going to look right under the hood of this 14-point memorandum of understanding.
Yeah. Because there is so much to unpack.
Exactly. We need to understand the military concessions, the staggering economic incentives, and the massive hurdles standing in the way of a final deal.
Mm-hmm.
And, we are pulling from a really wide range of sources for this.
Right. We've got reporting from Turkish news outlets like Yeni Shafak, Dünya Gazetesi, and Gazette Oxygen.
Yeah, plus Bloomberg HT, and this really dense but fascinating maritime legal analysis from Holland Knight. So our mission today is to objectively analyze this text from both the military and economic perspectives.
Which is crucial because this agreement literally dictates the price of oil.
Exactly. Meaning it directly dictates global inflation and the numbers you see at your local gas pump. So before we jump in, if you find these deep dives into the mechanics of global trade and geopolitics helpful, please make sure you subscribe to the channel and like this video so we can keep untangling these topics for you.
And the best place to start untangling is definitely the security baseline, because before we talk about the money and the oil, we have to look at the immediate military cessation. The very first pillar of the document mandates an immediate, permanent end to kinetic operations on all fronts.
And just for anyone who doesn't spend all their time reading Pentagon press briefings, kinetic is just military jargon for active physical warfare.
Yeah, shooting, bombing, drone strikes.
Right. A full stop to physical violence.
Yeah.
But the timeline they've attached to dismantling this military architecture is wild.
It's incredibly aggressive.
Yeah, the U.S. commits to lifting its naval blockade within 30 days. And they agree to pull their forces away from the proximity of Iran, but, and this is key, only 30 days after a final permanent deal is reached.
Right, and the reciprocal requirement for Iran is where the real logistical nightmare begins.
Oh, yeah.
Iran is mandated to clear all military obstacles and naval mines from the Strait of Hormuz within 30 days. And when you read the regional reporting, like from Dünya Gazetesi, they emphasize the sheer geographical panic this induces.
Because it's so narrow.
Right. Exactly. The Strait of Hormuz is only about 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. But the designated shipping lanes are literally just 2 miles wide in either direction.
Wow. And, naval mines aren't just like those floating spike balls from old movies.
Oh, not at all.
We're dealing with acoustic mines that detonate when they hear the specific engine signature of an oil tanker, or magnetic mines that just lie dormant on the seafloor until a massive steel hull passes overhead.
Great.
So finding and disarming those requires specialized sonar, unmanned underwater vehicles, huge mine-sweeping fleets. I mean, doing that thoroughly in 30 days seems practically impossible. Is 60 days actually enough time to dismantle decades of military buildup, or is this timeline purely symbolic?
Well, from a pure engineering standpoint, it is incredibly ambitious. I mean, you cannot declare a waterway that handles a fifth of the world's oil completely safe in a month unless you know exactly where every single device was placed.
Right, which is a huge if.
Exactly. So the 30-day mandate is less about finishing the job flawlessly and more about forcing immediate, verifiable momentum. If the clock is ticking, neither side can afford to let the negotiations just stall out into a frozen conflict.
That makes sense. And that brings us to the other massive security component, which is the nuclear program.
The core of the issue.
Right. The initial justification for this entire standoff was the U.S. aiming to stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. The text of this interim deal freezes Iran's nuclear program, and Iran reiterated it will not build a weapon.
Yeah.
But the actual mechanism of compliance is what caught my eye. They have to deal with a 970-pound, so that's roughly 440 kilograms stockpile of near-weapons-grade uranium.
And that stockpile is the center of the international anxiety. I mean, near weapons grade means the uranium has been enriched to around 60% purity.
Right.
It really doesn't take much more centrifugal processing to push that to the 90% needed for a warhead.
Right.
So the agreement mandates that this stockpile has to be diluted on site under the direct physical supervision of the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency.
Which mechanically makes perfect sense because you can't just throw highly radioactive material in the trash.
No, definitely not.
And moving it across borders is a logistical nightmare. So you blend it, you take that 60% enriched uranium and mix it with natural or depleted uranium.
Right.
It's essentially like taking a highly volatile, high-proof alcohol and watering it down until it's physically impossible to ignite.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah, once it's blended down to like 5 or 20%, it's only useful for civilian power generation. Re-enriching it would require starting that whole highly monitorable process all over again.
And that physical alteration is what gives the U.S. the tangible security guarantee it needs, because the uranium is chemically altered in a way that provides a massive breakout time.
Meaning the time it would take Iran to rush for a bomb if they decided to tear up the agreement.
Exactly.
So the way this whole 60-day window is structured, it's basically like an escrow account in real estate.
Oh, yeah, totally.
Like, neither side gets the final prize, the U.S. doesn't get the permanent nuclear rollback, and Iran doesn't get the permanent lifting of all sanctions until the underlying conditions, the mine clearing, lifting the blockade, the dilution, are inspected and certified by third parties.
Right.
But, an escrow account only works if the payout at the end is worth the wait. And the economic payout in this text is astronomical.
It's massive. If the military stipulations are the stick, the economic provisions are this massive carrot driving the agreement forward.
Yeah.
The MAOU outlines the creation of a staggering $300 billion reconstruction and economic development fund for Iran.
$300 billion. I mean, the reporting on how this fund was actually structured is fascinating. Jared Kushner reportedly pitched this, right?
He did. His concept was to structure this not as foreign aid, but as an international investment fund. The explicit goal is to allow Western energy giants to enter the newly opened Iranian market.
Which is such a deliberate maneuver around domestic U.S. politics.
Yeah.
Because President Trump had this very firm red line that absolutely no U.S. taxpayer budget money would go into this fund.
Exactly.
So how does the U.S. administration navigate the optics of orchestrating a $300 billion windfall for Iran without technically spending American taxpayer dollars?
Well, it's all about avoiding political suicide, right? If they
Right.
just handed over cash, it would be framed domestically as reparations. But by structuring it as a lucrative investment vehicle, the pitch becomes about American and global energy companies generating massive profits by developing Iran's antiquated oil infrastructure.
Okay, so the U.S. brings its leverage to the table by lifting the sanctions rather than writing a check.
Precisely.
But still, $300 billion is a massive pool of capital. And according to the sources, Gulf countries have reportedly already funded half of that amount, which honestly at first glance feels completely counterintuitive.
It really does.
I mean, Saudi Arabia and the UAE are historical rivals of Iran. Why would they inject $150 billion into the economy of their primary geopolitical adversary?
It comes down to cold, calculated self-interest. The Gulf states export their own massive volumes of oil and LNG through the exact same Strait of Hormuz.
Right.
So whenever tensions spike and the threat of a closed strait looms, their economies are directly threatened. Investing $150 billion in Iran's infrastructure is essentially an insurance policy for them.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, they are buying regional stability. If Iran's economy is deeply intertwined with Gulf capital, Iran has a massive financial disincentive to ever threaten those shipping lanes again. Peace just becomes far more profitable.
That makes the other major economic pillar of this agreement even more significant, which is the unfreezing of $24 billion in Iranian funds that are currently blocked in foreign banks.
Right. And I remember earlier drafts of these negotiations. The previous ideas involved routing this $24 billion through Qatar, strictly for humanitarian aid like food and medicine.
Yes, Qatar has the banking infrastructure and the neutrality to act as a watchdog.
But the final 14-point text completely abandons that safeguard. The final agreement grants the Iranian central bank full, unrestricted access to designate the beneficiaries. The funds don't have to route through a third-party monitor anymore.
Which is a colossal shift in sovereignty.
Hmm.
The U.S. is essentially trusting the Iranian government to allocate a $24 billion sudden cash injection without any external humanitarian guardrails.
Right. The local economic incentives for Iran are completely clear here. But let's pivot to why the rest of the world cares, because the shockwaves this sent through global energy markets were immediate. Let's talk about the oil.
The Strait of Hormuz.
Yes.
The text mandates the immediate reopening of the strait for free, safe passage. And to put the scale of this into perspective, roughly 20% of total global oil consumption passes through this single choke point. 20%.
Yeah.
It's like the world's most vital financial artery. If it's clogged, the whole global economy has a heart attack.
Exactly.
And we should note a critical detail from the reporting. Iran previously demanded the right to charge a transit fee for ships moving through their territorial waters.
Right, but Trump categorically rejected that.
Yeah, insisting that international waters have to remain toll-free. So, to grease the wheels and keep the oil flowing, the U.S. instead granted immediate 60-day waivers for Iranian crude oil and petrochemical exports.
Alongside crucial exemptions for banking, insurance, and shipping services.
Right, and the commodity markets reacted instantly. The global benchmarks plummeted. Brent crude fell to $77.72 a barrel.
Wow.
And WTI West Texas Intermediate dropped to $74.59. Those price drops are just the market breathing a massive sigh of relief.
Absolutely, because those benchmarks dictate everything downstream.
Right, from jet fuel to diesel for delivery trucks. When Brent drops, global inflation cools down. But, and this is where it gets complicated, I was reading that maritime legal analysis from Holland and Knight.
The P&I clubs?
Exactly. They paint a much more sobering picture of the reality on the water. The waivers are signed, the political agreement is public, but a lot of tanker operators are still refusing to move their ships into Iranian ports. So if the deal says the strait is open, why are tanker operators still too spooked to actually move their ships through it?
Well, the Holland and Knight brief exposes the massive gap between diplomatic agreements and commercial risk assessment.
Right.
It all comes down to the protection and indemnity clubs, the P&I clubs. These are the massive mutual insurance associations that underwrite global shipping. A very large crude carrier carries millions of barrels of oil.
Right.
If one of those ships hits an undiscovered mine, the cost of the lost hull, the cargo, the environmental cleanup, it runs into the billions.
And there's also the risk of secondary sanctions. The U.S. waivers only last for 60 days. If an operator loads a massive tanker with Iranian crude on day 45 of this truce, that ship might take weeks to reach its destination in Asia or Europe.
Exactly.
So if the U.S.-Iran deal collapses on day 61 while that ship is still in transit, that vessel is suddenly carrying highly illegal, heavily sanctioned cargo. The P&I Club could instantly revoke the ship's insurance mid-voyage to avoid being sanctioned by the U.S. Treasury.
And without insurance, that ship cannot dock at any major international port. It becomes a pariah vessel.
Wow.
So commercial shipping companies look at that 60-day timeline and just see unacceptable volatility. Mukesh Sadev, an energy analyst writing for Bloomberg HT, pointed out that because of this hesitation, short-term global oil supply might actually remain surprisingly tight.
So the oil is legally allowed to flow, but the physical ships are paralyzed by bureaucratic and financial risk.
Exactly. The ink on the treaty is dry, but the actual water is frozen by risk modeling.
That's wild. But if they do manage to bridge that gap and secure a final deal, the long-term forecast flips completely.
Oh, completely. The International Energy Agency, the IEA, issued a warning that if this deal holds and Iran's heavily discounted reserves fully re-enter the market, we could see a massive global supply glut by 2027.
So we'd swing from a market terrified of a shortage to a market drowning in surplus crude.
Yeah. But transitioning from this fragile 60-day interim phase to that permanent reality requires navigating severe regional crises.
Right.
Which brings us to the biggest obstacle threatening the 60-day clock, the ongoing conflict in Lebanon.
Right, because you can't look at this deal in a vacuum.
Yeah.
Having established the massive global stakes, we have to look at the reality on the ground and why reaching that final agreement at the end of the 60 days is going to be incredibly difficult.
The 14-point document attempts to address Lebanon by establishing a formal de-escalation cell.
Okay.
The goal is to manage and defuse the fighting. But this is where proxy warfare makes diplomacy incredibly messy. Hezbollah publicly refuses to accept any final nuclear deal unless Israel completely withdraws its forces from Lebanon.
But Israel wasn't even a participant. in these U.S.-Iran negotiations.
Exactly. The Israeli government is fighting a multi-front conflict. Prime Minister Netanyahu has firmly refused to withdraw based on a U.S.-Iran timetable.
And the friction there is palpable. Reports indicate a recent phone call between Donald Trump and Netanyahu became intensely heated, with Trump reportedly calling the Israeli prime minister unbalanced.
Right.
And despite the signed MOU, the clashes on the ground in Lebanon are still ongoing today. So, since Israel wasn't at the negotiating table, doesn't that make the Lebanon de-escalation cell practically toothless from the start?
Technically and legally, yes. The cell has zero direct authority over Israel. The entire concept relies entirely on leverage.
Right.
The architecture assumes that if Washington and Tehran can agree on a broader framework, they can turn around and apply overwhelming pressure on their respective allies to stand down.
So it's proxy diplomacy. Hezbollah is leveraging Iran's desire for sanctions relief, saying, you don't get your $300 billion until we get our military victory. And Israel is asserting its sovereign right to ignore a timeline it didn't negotiate.
The de-escalation cell is the central pressure point. If the U.S. cannot compel Israel and Iran cannot compel Hezbollah, the violence continues, the 60-day clock runs out, and the entire 14-point agreement shatters.
And the domestic U.S. opposition is already building. Republican Senator Lindsey Graham made a very public threat that if these negotiations fail, the U.S. will utilize its military to take the Strait of Hormuz by force.
Which is a stark reminder of the intense political pressure back in Washington.
It's like they're trying to build a delicate house of cards while several different people are actively kicking the table.
That's exactly what it is. You have the logistical impossibility of clearing naval mines in a month, international insurers terrified of moving oil, and an active conflict in Lebanon.
So just to briefly recap all of this for you listening, we are looking at an incredibly ambitious 14-point military and economic truce. It aims to reopen the world's most crucial oil artery, freeze a nuclear program, and inject $300 billion into a newly opened market.
All while navigating intense regional conflicts and a tight 60-day deadline.
Exactly. And this delicate diplomatic dance directly affects global inflation and your own energy costs.
But I want to leave you with a different scenario to consider.
Okay.
If this 14-point agreement actually holds, and Western energy giants, backed by a $300 billion fund, flood into Iran, what happens to the broader geopolitical map?
Oh, wow.
Does this effectively price Russia and China out of the Middle East? Does it transform a former adversary into a reluctant, massive hub for Western capital?
That is the ultimate geopolitical chess move. It's not just about stopping a conflict, it's about buying out the board. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive today. Keep questioning the headlines, keep an eye on that 60-day clock, and we will see you next time.